Steve Garvey, Keith Hernandez, Mookie Wilson, they all had front row seats to watch him build a career defined by conflict and questionable choices. The packaging says he was pathetic. And when you look at what these legends actually witnessed, you start to understand why that label stuck. Because the story of Bill Buckner is not just about one error. It is about a man who seemed to create the conditions for his own destruction. 19 days before the moment that would define his life, Bill Buckner sat down for an interview. October 6, 1986. A reporter asked him about the pressure of the postseason. His answer was chilling. The dreams are that you are going to have a great series and win. The nightmares are that you are going to let the winning run score on a ground ball through your legs. Those things happen, you know? I think a lot of it is just fate. Think about that for a second. He literally described the exact scenario that would happen. The media would later use this quote to frame his error not as a physical mistake, but as a psychological collapse, a self-fulfilling prophecy. And maybe they had a point, because when you look at Buckner's career, the 1986 error was not some random act of fate. It was the final domino in a long chain of conflicts, bad decisions, and physical compromises that all pointed toward one inevitable conclusion. Years later, after the Red Sox finally won in 2004, fans wanted to offer Buckner forgiveness. He rejected it. "I feel like the guy who got put away for a crime he did not commit," he said. And then the DNA evidence comes back 30 years later and the guy gets out of jail. What do you say for the 30 years he spent suffering? "I do not feel like I have committed a crime." But here's the thing. When you examine the DNA evidence, when you look at the conflicts and choices that shaped his career, you realize that while Buckner might not have been the only guilty party, he definitely played a role in his own conviction. The nightmares he described were not just bad luck. They were the predictable outcome of decisions he made, conflicts he created, and a stubbornness that would not let him accept his physical limitations. Let me show you what the legend saw. The story really begins in Los Angeles, long before Boston, long before that ground ball. 1968. The Dodgers draft class was legendary. Bill Buckner, Steve Garvey, Ron C., Davey Lopes. Future stars all selected in the same year. Buckner was a gifted athlete. He played first base. He was highly regarded as an outfielder, too. By 1973, after Wes Parker retired, Buckner had moved to first base full-time. This was his position. This was his future. Then there was Steve Garvey, the photogenic, fan-friendly, media-accessible all-American success story. Problem was, Garvey could not throw. He was a disaster at third base. So bad that rumors started circulating that his days in the Dodgers organization were numbered. His career was not looking good. Except for pinch hitting, he seemed to have no path forward. Manager Walter Alston had a lineup problem, and someone suggested a solution. That someone, according to Buckner himself, was Bill Buckner. Here is what Buckner said about it. The Dodgers tried Steve Garvey at third base and at left field. Except for pinch hitting, his career was not looking too well. I suggested this to Alston, and rest assured, I never played first base again. Alston moved me to left field. Read that again. I suggested this to Alston. Buckner actively suggested the move that would displace him from his own position. Garvey took to first base like a duck to water. He became the anchor of the durable Dodgers infield. He won multiple Gold Gloves. Meanwhile, Buckner was pushed back to the outfield. And here's where the negative angle really kicks in. This was not just a career setback. This move had a direct causal link to what happened in 1986. Playing the outfield exacerbated a chronic ankle injury. Those ailing ankles, the ones that would fail him 13 years later, started getting worse because he gave up his natural position to help save Steve Garvey's career. The conflict with Garvey was not just a rivalry. It was the origin point of Buckner's eventual physical breakdown. He helped create the very injury that would make him unable to field that ground ball. You want to talk about poor decisions? Buckner essentially sacrificed his body to help a competitor. And Garvey, the man he saved, went on to become a legend while Buckner hobbled through the rest of his career on ankles that never fully recovered. Think about the long-term consequences of that one suggestion. Buckner gave away his natural defensive position. First base is easier on the body than outfield. Less running, less lateral movement, less stress on joints. The outfield requires constant movement, quick bursts of speed, sudden stops and starts. All of that wears down the ankles over time. Buckner spent years doing that wear and tear, years that added up, years that created the chronic soreness that would define the final stage of his career. By 1986, those ankles were so damaged that Buckner needed high-top cleats just to play. Think about that. He could not even wear normal baseball shoes. He needed extra support just to walk on the field. And this all traced back to June 23, 1973, the day he suggested Garvey play first base. The day he volunteered to sacrifice his body for someone else's career. But the Los Angeles years taught Buckner something else too. Something that would also come back to hurt him. Toughness. His minor league manager was Tommy Lasorda. Lasorda loved Buckner. When Buckner died, Lasorda mourned him as one of the greatest ever. What did Lasorda love about him? His legendary, almost pathological competitiveness and toughness. Lasorda told a famous story. Buck broke his jaw and the front office told me to sit him out for 5 weeks. Buckner missed only one game and wound up hitting .3, 3.5, and learned to spit and swear with his jaw wired shut. This was the gamer identity, the workhorse, the guy who never sits out. Lasorda cultivated this trait and praised it, and Buckner built his entire identity around it. Here's the irony. That toughness, that refusal to sit out, is exactly why Buckner stayed in Game 6 of the 1986 World Series. By that point, he was 36. His ankles were shot. He needed high-top cleats just to manage the pain. His manager had a healthy defensive replacement on the bench. But Buckner, the tough guy, the gamer, stayed in. He refused to accept a defensive substitution. The very identity that Lasorda praised, that made Buckner feel like a warrior, became his liability. If you like honest baseball analysis, hit that subscribe button now because we're just getting started with how this whole thing fell apart. His toughness was not a virtue, it was stubbornness. And it facilitated his public ruin. So now we arrive at 1986, Game 6 of the World Series. The moment everyone remembers, except the version everyone remembers is wrong. Because Buckner's error was not the failure. It was just the final visible mistake in a cascade of collapses that started long before he ever touched the ball. Let me walk you through what actually happened, and let me show you how everyone from the manager to the pitchers to the media built the trap that Buckner would fall into. First, the manager, John McNamara. His failure was the most egregious because it directly enabled everything that followed. Throughout the entire 1986 postseason, in all 7 of the Red Sox victories, McNamara had a pattern, a strategy. He pulled Buckner in the late innings for a defensive replacement, Dave Stapleton. Stapleton was a utility man on the roster specifically for this purpose. Every single time the Red Sox won, McNamara made this substitution. Game 6, the most important defensive inning of the season, the 10th inning, 1 out away from a championship. McNamara froze. He abandoned the strategy that had gotten him there. He left a physically compromised Buckner in the game. His excuse? Sentimental. He wanted Buckner, the veteran, to be on the field when we won. That was his first explanation. When people criticized this reasoning, McNamara changed his story. Years later, he tried to protect himself by attacking his other player. He claimed he did not trust Stapleton. He said Dave Stapleton's nickname was Shaky. And you know what that implies. This is the smoking gun. The Shaky claim was a lie, a fabrication. An analysis shows that Stapleton had committed a total of 1 error in 3 seasons. 1 error in 3 years, and McNamara had the nerve to call him shaky to justify his own managerial malpractice. McNamara was willing to slander a player's reputation to cover his own failure. This is the toxic, blame-shifting environment that made a single scapegoat necessary. And McNamara made sure it would not be him. But before we even get to Buckner's error, let me tell you about the pitcher who actually blew the game, Calvin Schiraldi, reliever. He came into the bottom of the 10th inning with a 5-3 lead. The Red Sox were 3 outs away from winning the World Series. Schiraldi retired the first 2 batters. 1 out away, then he completely collapsed. 3 consecutive 2-out singles. Gary Carter, Kevin Mitchell, Ray Knight. The lead was cut to 5-4. The tying and winning runs were on base. Schiraldi was the pitcher who blew the lead, not Buckner. Schiraldi. And it gets worse. Schiraldi took the loss in Game 7. He allowed 3 runs in just 1/3 of an inning. By any objective pitching metric, Schiraldi, not Buckner, was the GOAT of the series. But his failure was immediately erased by the visual drama of what happened next. The media ignored him. They needed a simpler story, and Schiraldi was not it. Here is something interesting about Schiraldi. He had been acquired from the Mets. Think about that irony. The Red Sox got him from the very team they were playing against, and he ended up blowing the series for Boston. You would think that detail would be part of the story. The former Met coming back to haunt his old team, except he helps them instead. But no, the media buried that narrative. It was too complicated. They wanted something clean and simple. So McNamara finally pulled Schiraldi. He brought in Bob Stanley to face Mookie Wilson, and Stanley immediately made everything worse. With Knight on second and Mitchell on third, Stanley uncorked a wild pitch. It was a clear miscommunication with catcher Rich Gedman. Stanley said Gedman set up outside for a pitch intended to be inside. Other players claimed Gedman expected a sinker but got a fastball. The pitch was so errant that Mookie Wilson had to dive out of the way. It was scored a wild pitch, though many critics argued it was a passed ball that Gedman should have blocked. The result? Kevin Mitchell scored from third. The game was tied, 5-5. Read that again. The game was already tied before Mookie Wilson hit the ball to Bill Buckner. Buckner's error did not cost the Red Sox the lead. Stanley and Schiraldi had already lost it. Buckner's error only hastened the loss that had already been secured by the pitchers. But here is the most insidious part. One fan account claims to have seen a clip of Stanley in the clubhouse after the game. Stanley was allegedly deflecting blame and saying something like, "If Buckner gets that." If that account is true and multiple sources reference it, then Stanley immediately and actively pointed the media narrative toward Buckner to absolve himself of the wild pitch that tied the game. Stanley threw Buckner under the bus before Buckner even made it to the clubhouse. Let me break down the blame here because it matters. Schiraldi surrendered 3 consecutive 2-out singles. He blew the 5-3 lead. He allowed the tying and winning runs to reach base. The media largely ignored him. McNamara left an injured Buckner in the game and failed to use Stapleton. He abandoned his winning strategy. He later deflected blame onto Stapleton by calling him shaky. Stanley threw a wild pitch. The tying run scored because of him. He deflected blame to Gedman and to Buckner. Gedman failed to block the wild pitch. Some criticized him, but Stanley's pitch was deemed not catchable. And then Buckner. Fielding error on Wilson's grounder. The winning run scored from second base. He became the sole goat and symbol of the curse. You see the problem? 5 different failures. 5 different people who contributed to the collapse, but only one guy took the blame. And that guy was the one who made the final, most visible mistake. Not the most important mistake, just the one everyone could see. Now let me show you what the Mets legends saw from the other dugout, because their criticism is even more damning. Keith Hernandez, Mets first baseman, when he made the second out of the 10th inning, he was so convinced the game was over that he gave up. He walked off the field, he went down the tunnel. He retreated into manager Davey Johnson's office to watch the end of the game on television. He thought it was done. Think about what that means. The Red Sox had a 99% win expectancy at that moment. They did not just lose. They achieved a failure so total and so improbable that their opponent's star player had already conceded. Hernandez later discussed the play in terms of a total defensive breakdown. Buckner's positioning. Stanley's failure to cover first base. The Red Sox did not lose because of fate. They lost because they fell apart. Then there is Mookie Wilson, the man who hit the little roller. Wilson and Buckner later became friends. But Wilson's baseball analysis has always been a criticism of the single error narrative. Wilson and his teammates have consistently maintained that even if Buckner had fielded the ball cleanly, Wilson's elite speed would have made it a toss-up at first base. If Buckner had fielded the ball and lost the race to the bag, the game would have continued. Tied 5-5. Runners on first and third. This is critical. The curse story hinges on the idea that Buckner's error was the singular game-losing moment. Wilson's analysis suggests that the Red Sox's late-inning defense was so physically compromised, Buckner's ankles, and so psychologically broken, Stanley's wild pitch, that the Mets' victory was tactically inevitable. Even without the error, Boston was collapsing. Wilson's speed meant Buckner was probably going to fail no matter what he did. So Buckner was trapped. His ankles, damaged from years in the outfield after giving up first base to Garvey, made him slow. His tough guy identity, forged by Lasorda, kept him in the game when he should have been pulled. His manager abandoned the winning strategy. His pitchers collapsed before he ever touched the ball. And even if he had made the play, the odds of getting Wilson out were questionable at best. But the media needed a villain, and they found one. Except they had to ignore a few things to make the story work. Dwight Evans, Red Sox legend, all-star, beloved. In Game 4, with the series tied 1-1, Mets hitter Lenny Dykstra hit a long fly ball to right field. The ball hit the heel of Evans's glove and bounced over the wall for a home run. The broadcast announcer noted the image of Evans leaning against the wall in frustration is worth more than 1,000 words. The Mets won that game 6-2. Evans's error tied the series 2-2. Let me be clear, both Buckner and Evans, 2 veterans, committed defensive miscues in the World Series. Both plays contributed to losses. Yet Evans's error was forgotten. Buckner's became the symbol of 68 years of failure. Why? Because Evans was a beloved homegrown star. Buckner was a former Cub, an outsider, and he was wearing a Cubs batting glove under his mitt during the error, visually linking him to another cursed franchise. He was the perfect expendable goat. Let me talk about that Cubs connection because it matters more than you might think. Buckner was not a Red Sox lifer. He did not come up through their system. He was not born and raised in Boston. He played for the Dodgers, then the Cubs. He spent 7 seasons in Chicago. He wore their uniform, he became their player, and then he came to Boston in 1984, just 2 years before the World Series. 2 years. That is not enough time to become a true Boston icon. Not in the eyes of the fans, especially Red Sox fans who value homegrown loyalty above almost everything. Buckner was an outsider, a hired gun, a player they acquired, not one they developed. And when things went wrong, that outsider status made him easy to sacrifice. But it gets worse. That Cubs batting glove, the one he was wearing under his mitt during the error. The cameras caught it. and fans noticed. Here was a Red Sox player in the World Series representing Boston, and he was wearing a piece of Cubs equipment. For some fans, that was the ultimate betrayal. It was visual proof that Buckner was not really one of them. He still had ties to Chicago. He still identified with another franchise. Even in the biggest moment of his Boston career, he could not let go of his past. Now, to be fair, lots of players wear equipment from different teams. It is common. It means nothing. But when you are looking for reasons to blame someone, when you need a scapegoat, these little details become ammunition. The Cubs glove was not the reason Buckner became the villain, but it was a symbol that fans could point to, evidence that he was never really a Red Sox player at heart. And here is the kicker. The Cubs themselves had their own curse, the curse of the Billy Goat. They had not won a World Series since 1908, so Buckner became a bridge between two curses. Two franchises defined by failure. The narrative wrote itself. The cursed player from the cursed team bringing his bad luck to another cursed team. It was too perfect, too clean. The media could not resist. The media did not just report on a scapegoat. They created one. The evidence was there. The complete collapse of Schiraldi, the game-tying wild pitch by Stanley, the managerial malpractice of McNamara, the forgotten parallel error by Evans. All of it was available, but that complex reality was too good to pass up. It was sacrificed for a simpler, more dramatic narrative. The curse of the Bambino personified by one man. A routine ground ball going through the legs of a player who had already vocalized that exact nightmare. It was a story too clean to fact-check. The Boston media and fan base were ruthless. Buckner and his family were subjected to a living hell. Effective exile. The media replayed the error thousands of times. Context be damned. They actively catered to and fueled the blind hatred that defined Buckner's life. They deliberately withheld evidence for decades. They prosecuted him in the court of public opinion and made sure he stayed convicted. Let me tell you what that living hell actually looked like, because the media's role did not end with the error. It was just beginning. The visual of the error became inescapable. Every sports broadcast, every highlight reel, every discussion of curses or failures or chokes. There was Buckner, legs apart, ball rolling through, Ray Knight crossing home plate, over and over and over. The media turned a 3-second moment into a cultural touchstone. They made it impossible for anyone to forget. And more importantly, they made it impossible for Buckner to escape. The replays were constant, relentless. Every October when the playoffs started, there was Buckner. Every time a team choked, there was Buckner. Every time someone made an error in a big moment, there was Buckner. The media used his failure as the universal symbol of athletic collapse. They turned him into a punchline, a cautionary tale, a ghost story that baseball told itself over and over. And each replay was a fresh wound, because Buckner had to watch it. His family had to watch it. His children had to see their father defined by the worst moment of his life. Imagine being Buckner's kid in school, having to defend your father while every sports show in America replayed his error, having to hear other kids laugh about it, having to pretend it did not hurt. The media profited from his misery. They used the clip to drive ratings, to sell documentaries, to generate controversy and clicks. Buckner's pain became their product, and they showed no mercy in exploiting it. They did not care that he was a human being, that he had a family, that the constant replay was destroying his life. They only cared about the story, the narrative, the curse. But here is what made it worse. Remember that interview from October 6th? The one where Buckner described his nightmare about letting a ground ball through his legs? The media weaponized it. They took a moment of honest vulnerability, a player admitting his fears, and they used it to construct a narrative of psychological weakness. They framed Buckner not as a victim of circumstance, but as a man who manifested his own failure, as if talking about a fear somehow made you responsible for it coming true. ESPN even made a documentary about it, Catching Hell. They framed Buckner's quote as evidence of a psychological collapse. They used it to suggest that Buckner had somehow cursed himself, that his nightmare was a premonition, a self-fulfilling prophecy. The documentary did not focus on McNamara's failure or Stanley's wild pitch or Schiraldi's collapse. It focused on Buckner and his quote. It turned his honesty into his biggest liability. Think about how twisted that is. A player gives an honest answer about the pressure of postseason baseball, He admits what every player fears, and when that fear becomes reality, the media uses his honesty against him. They turned his words into evidence of mental collapse. They made it seem like Buckner had cursed himself, that his nightmare quote was proof he was psychologically fragile, that he deserved what happened because he had imagined it first. That is not journalism. That is character assassination. And the fans? They followed the media's lead. Buckner received death threats. His family was harassed. The hatred was so intense that Buckner and his family eventually left Boston. They went into what can only be described as exile. Not because Buckner wanted to leave, but because staying meant subjecting his wife and children to constant abuse. The media created the narrative, the fans enforced it, and Buckner paid the price. Think about what that exile meant. Buckner had to leave a city where he had played baseball, where he had teammates and friends, where he had built a life. He had to uproot his entire family because the environment became too toxic to survive. That is not just losing a game. That is losing your home, your community, your sense of safety and belonging. And the economic cost was real too. Buckner lost endorsement opportunities, lost speaking engagements, lost the chance to have a normal post-playing career in Boston. Other players retired and became beloved local figures. They did radio shows, opened businesses, became part of the community fabric. Buckner got none of that. His error cost him not just his reputation, but his livelihood, his future, his ability to capitalize on a 22-year career of hard work. Now let me talk about 2004. The Red Sox finally won the World Series, broke the curse. And suddenly, Boston fans wanted to offer forgiveness. They invited Buckner to throw out the first pitch at the home opener in 2005. The media covered it like some kind of redemption story, like Buckner was finally being released from prison, finally being pardoned. Buckner went along with it. He threw the pitch, he waved to the crowd, but his words told a different story. I feel like the guy who got put away for a crime he did not commit. And then the DNA evidence comes back 30 years later and the guy gets out of jail. What do you say for the 30 years he spent suffering? I do not feel like I have committed a crime. That quote reveals everything. Buckner rejected the premise of forgiveness. Because forgiveness implies guilt. It implies you did something wrong and now you are being absolved. Buckner was saying no. I do not accept your forgiveness because I was not the one who committed the crime. You convicted me. You ignored the evidence. You destroyed my life over something I did not do. And now you want me to be grateful that you are letting me back in? The audacity of Red Sox fans thinking they had the right to forgive him. After they chased him out of the city. After they tormented his family. After they made his life hell for 18 years. They won a World Series and suddenly decided Buckner deserved peace. As if their forgiveness meant anything. As if they had the moral authority to grant it. And here is the thing that makes Buckner's anger even more justified. The media never corrected the record. Even after 2004, even after the redemption tour, the mainstream narrative never changed. Buckner was still the GOAT. The error was still replayed. The full context was still ignored. McNamara's failure, Stanley's wild pitch, Schiraldi's collapse, Evans's forgotten error. None of it became part of the popular story. The media had their villain and they were not letting go. Buckner spent the rest of his life fighting that narrative, doing interviews, explaining what really happened, pointing out all the failures that preceded his error. And some people listened. Some analysts and writers started acknowledging the fuller picture, but it did not matter. The damage was done. The image was burned into public memory. Buckner's legacy was sealed. He died in 2019. And even in the obituaries, even in the tributes, the error was always mentioned. Sometimes it was the headline. The error defined him more than his 22-year career, more than his 2,700 hits, more than his all-star selection. The media made sure of that. They turned one moment into an entire identity. They convicted him in the court of public opinion and never let him appeal. And what about the others? What happened to McNamara and Stanley and Schiraldi? McNamara eventually got fired, but not immediately. He managed part of the next season. He later got other coaching jobs. He was criticized for his Game 6 decision, but he was never vilified. He lived a quiet life, and when he died, his obituary mentioned the series, but he was not defined by it. Stanley played a few more years. He was booed sometimes, but nothing like Buckner. He stayed in Boston, had a normal post-career life, no exile, no death threats. Schiraldi bounced around a few teams and then retired. He was barely remembered for his role in the series. The media let all of them off the hook. They focused all their energy on one man. That is selective scapegoating. That is narrative construction. And that is why Buckner's crime metaphor is so powerful. He was not just blamed for something that was not entirely his fault. He was deliberately chosen as the fall guy while others who failed worse were protected. The prosecution withheld evidence. The judge was biased. The jury was rigged. And Buckner served the full sentence while the real criminals walked free. Let me give you one more piece of context that shows just how unfair this all was. Buckner had a 22-year career. 22 years. He played from 1969 to 1990. He accumulated 2,700 hits. He had a career batting average of .289. He was an all-star. He won a batting title. By any measure, he had a successful career. A career most players would dream of having. But none of that mattered. None of it was remembered. Because the media reduced his entire career to 3 seconds. 3 seconds out of 22 years. Think about that ratio. Over 2 decades of professional baseball, thousands of games, tens of thousands of at-bats. Countless defensive plays, all of it erased by one error. That is not fair. That is not reasonable. That is not journalism. That is narrative obsession. And the media knew what they were doing. They knew Buckner had a long, successful career. They knew he was a good player. But that did not serve the story they wanted to tell. The story of the curse required a villain, a symbol, a single moment that encapsulated 86 years of Red Sox failure. Buckner's career accomplishments did not fit that narrative, so they ignored them. They buried them. They made sure that when people thought of Bill Buckner, they only thought of the error. So let me bring this all together. The crime metaphor that Buckner used, the idea that he was put away for something he did not do. Is it accurate? Here is what we know. Buckner's career was defined by negative interactions and poor choices. He was positionally compromised by Steve Garvey, a move that directly led to the ankle injuries that hobbled him in 1986. He suggested that Garvey take his spot, his own decision. He was a victim of the toughness ethos Tommy Lasorda championed, an identity that kept an injured player on the field when he should have been pulled. He built that identity himself, embraced it, refused to let go of it. In the 1986 World Series, he was the final visible domino in a systemic collapse. But he was only the final domino because Schiraldi blew the save, because Stanley threw the tying run home, and because McNamara abandoned a winning strategy and later lied to cover it. He became the scapegoat because the media ignored the equal and greater failures of franchise icons like Evans. So was Buckner wrongfully convicted? Not entirely. He made mistakes. His stubbornness kept him in the game. His physical limitations, created in part by his own decisions with Garvey, made him unable to make the play. But was he the only one who failed? Absolutely not. Was he even the person who failed the most? Not even close. The negative angle here is that Buckner was a man who spent his career creating the conditions for his own downfall. He gave away his position. He destroyed his ankles. He built an identity around toughness that became stubbornness. He stayed in a game he should have left. And when everything collapsed, he was standing in the wrong place, at the wrong time, looking like the perfect person to blame. His conflicts with Garvey, his choices under Lasorda, his refusal to accept his limitations, they all fed into the moment. And then the media, the manager, and the teammates made sure he took the fall alone. Buckner served time for a crime he only partially committed. The DNA evidence shows that McNamara, Schiraldi, Stanley, and the media were all accomplices. But Buckner's own decisions, his own conflicts, his own stubborn refusal to step aside, they were part of the crime too. He might not have deserved all the blame, but he definitely earned some of it. That is the story the legends saw. A man trapped by his own choices. A man whose conflicts and compromises built a legacy of failure. A man whose nightmare became reality because he spent his career walking toward it. The packaging was right. When you look at what the legends witnessed, when you see the conflicts and the criticisms, you understand why Bill Buckner became the symbol of a curse. Not because he was the villain, but because he was the convenient one. And maybe, just maybe, because he helped make himself that way. Drop a comment below and tell me which part of this story you think matters most. Was it McNamara's lie about Stapleton? Stanley's wild pitch? Or was it Buckner's decision to give Garvey his position in the first place? Let me know what you think. When you hear someone say a legend can't play for anything, you expect drama. Especially when the guy they're talking about is Tom Seaver, one of the greatest pitchers to ever take the mound. The thumbnail says it all. He can't play for anything. And you're thinking this is going to be about rivals, about enemies and other dugouts, about players who couldn't stand him. But here's the twist that nobody sees coming. The baseball legends didn't hate Tom Seaver at all. Not Pete Rose, not Don Sutton, not Nolan Ryan, not Buddy Harrelson, not Dave Kingman. None of them. The real hatred came from somewhere else entirely. It came from the suits in the owner's box and the pens in the press room. And that hatred didn't just hurt Seaver, it destroyed an entire franchise. It turned one of baseball's proudest teams into a joke. And it created a stadium so empty and dead that fans gave it a name that still haunts the Mets to this day. So who actually hated Tom Seaver? Why did that hate consume them? And why did it turn a championship team into a graveyard? Let's find out. The story everyone thinks they know is simple. Tom Seaver was cocky. He demanded too much money. He thought he was better than everyone else. He looked down on his teammates. He started fights with rivals. The legends couldn't stand him. That's the narrative. That's what people believe. But when you look at what actually happened, when you dig into the real relationships Seaver had with the biggest names in baseball, that story falls apart fast. Start with Pete Rose, Charlie Hustle himself. The guy who played baseball like his life depended on it. The guy who ran to first base on a walk just to intimidate the pitcher. Rose and Seaver went head-to-head for years. Rose played for the Cincinnati Reds. Seaver pitched for the New York Mets. They were rivals in the truest sense. Rose was known for trash talking. He never stopped chirping at opponents. He got in their heads. He made them uncomfortable. If there was bad blood between them, if there was real hate, you'd expect it to be obvious. You'd expect it to show up in interviews, in their body language, in the way they talked about each other. But in 1979, they filmed a TV show together. It was called Greatest Sports Legends. And here's the kicker. Seaver was the host, Rose was the guest. They did a batting practice segment for the cameras. Rose joked around asking Seaver to throw him something easy. He said he didn't want a Tom Seaver fastball, just something he could hit. He was smiling, laughing. Seaver laughed right back and fired a response. He said maybe the only way Rose could get on base was by getting hit by a pitch. They were having fun, trading barbs, playing up their rivalry for the audience. This wasn't two guys who hated each other. This was two professionals who respected each other enough to play their roles, to give the fans what they wanted. And they did it again on the Mike Douglas Show in 1977. Same exact thing. Joking, laughing, playing the villain and the hero depending on who was talking. The feud was a show, it was theater, it was good for business, it was good for baseball, it sold tickets, it got people watching. But it wasn't real. It was never real. When Seaver got traded to the Reds in 1977, he and Rose became teammates. They wore the same uniform. They shared the same clubhouse. And Rose didn't just tolerate Seaver. He didn't just put up with him because they were on the same team. Rose became one of his greatest friends and advocates. He supported Seaver. He praised him. He talked about how great it was to have Seaver on his side instead of against him. The so-called hate vanished the second they wore the same uniform. Because it was never there in the first place. It was all smoke and mirrors. A story sold to fans who wanted to believe in larger-than-life rivalries. Then there's Don Sutton. Sutton pitched for the Los Angeles Dodgers. He was a craftsman on the mound, a future Hall of Famer just like Seaver. The two of them argued through the media about who was the better pitcher in the National League. Seaver said he was the best. Sutton said he was the best. It got heated. Reporters loved it. Fans picked sides. It looked like a real feud. The kind of rivalry that defines an era. Two aces battling for supremacy, fighting for respect, fighting for the title of best pitcher in baseball. But it wasn't Sutton who started it. It wasn't Sutton who wanted to fight. It was the Mets management. Specifically, it was M. Donald Grant. In 1976, Seaver was in the middle of a brutal contract fight with the team. He wanted more money. The market had changed. Salaries were going up. But the Mets chairman, M.F. Donald Grant, didn't want to pay Seaver what he was worth. So Grant needed leverage. He needed a way to make Seaver feel replaceable, to make him feel like he wasn't as special as he thought. So Grant threatened to trade Seaver to the Dodgers for Sutton. And he didn't just whisper it in a closed-door meeting. He made it a big story. He leaked it to the press. He wanted everyone to know. Suddenly, everyone was talking about a Seaver for Sutton swap. The media went crazy. Would the Mets really do it? Would they trade their franchise player? Reports started circulating that the deal was close, that it might happen any day. The whole thing became a circus. Grant used Sutton as a weapon. He used him as a bargaining chip in a war Sutton didn't ask to be part of. Grant wanted to send Seaver a message. You're replaceable. We can get another ace. You're not as important as you think you are. Sutton wasn't trying to take Seaver's job. He didn't ask to be dragged into this fight. He was just a name Grant threw around to make Seaver feel small, to put him in his place. The rivalry wasn't between the two pitchers. It was manufactured by management to win a contract negotiation. It was a tactic, a strategy, and it worked, at least temporarily, to put pressure on Seaver. What about Seaver's teammates? Didn't they resent him? Nolan Ryan was on the 1969 Miracle Mets with Seaver. They were friends, good friends. Ryan never had a problem with Seaver. The only reason Ryan's name ever came up in the feud was because a columnist used Ryan's salary to attack Seaver's wife. Ryan was a pawn. He didn't ask to be part of the fight. Buddy Harrelson played shortstop for the Mets. There were rumors that Harrelson didn't like Seaver because Seaver was too smart, too cerebral, but those rumors were garbage. Harrelson and Seaver were roommates. They were good friends. Seaver once said that having Harrelson at shortstop was like having another top pitcher on the field. That's not something you say about someone you don't respect. And then there's Dave Kingman. Kingman was a slugger. He was also fighting with the Mets front office over his contract. On the same night Seaver got traded, so did Kingman. Same team doing the trading. That tells you everything. This wasn't about Seaver being difficult. This was about management getting rid of anyone who stood up for themselves. What about Seaver's teammates? Didn't they resent him? Didn't they get tired of him being the star? Of him getting all the attention? Of him being called the franchise while they were just role players? That's what you'd think. That's what makes sense. Jealousy happens. Egos clash. But once again, when you look at the actual relationships, the story falls apart. Nolan Ryan was on the 1969 Miracle Mets with Seaver. That team shocked the world by winning the World Series. Nobody expected them to win. They were 100-to-1 underdogs, the amazing Mets. But they pulled it off, and Seaver and Ryan were both key parts of that team. Ryan was younger. He was still figuring things out. His control wasn't there yet. He threw hard, but he walked too many batters. But his arm was electric. Raw power. Everyone knew he had special talent. Everyone knew he would figure it out eventually. Seaver and Ryan were friends, good friends. They respected each other. They pushed each other to be better. There was no jealousy, no resentment. They were building something together. They were part of history. Ryan's name only came up in the feud years later, and it had nothing to do with Ryan himself. Nothing to do with Ryan having a problem with Seaver. The only reason Ryan got dragged into the fight was because a columnist named Dick Young used Ryan's salary to attack Seaver's wife. We'll get to that in detail soon. It's one of the ugliest moments in the whole story. But the point is, Ryan was a pawn. He was collateral damage. He didn't ask to be part of the fight. He didn't have a problem with Seaver. He was just a name that got used as a weapon. And Seaver knew it. He never blamed Ryan, because Ryan didn't do anything wrong. Ryan was innocent. He was just another victim of the machine that wanted to destroy Seaver. Then there's Buddy Harrelson. Harrelson played shortstop for the Mets. He was steady, reliable, consistent. The kind of player every team needs but fans don't always appreciate. Defense first, smart baseball. Harrelson made the plays. He turned double plays. He had great range. He was the anchor of the infield. There were rumors that Harrelson didn't like Seaver because Seaver was too smart, too cerebral. The rumor was that Harrelson felt like Seaver looked down on guys who didn't go to college, who weren't as educated, who didn't have the same intellectual approach to the game. The rumor painted Seaver as arrogant, as someone who thought he was better than everyone else. But those rumors were complete garbage. They were invented by people looking for drama, looking for conflict where none existed, looking for a storyline that would sell papers and get clicks. Harrelson and Seaver were roommates on the road. Think about that. You don't room with someone you don't like. You don't choose to spend that much time with someone who makes you uncomfortable. You don't share hotel rooms and meals and downtime with someone you resent. They were good friends. They had each other's backs. They trusted each other. Seaver once said that having Harrelson at shortstop every day was like having another top pitcher on the field. That's high praise. That's not something you say about someone you don't respect. That's not something you say about someone who resents you. That's the kind of compliment you give to a friend, to someone you rely on, to someone you value. And then there's Dave Kingman. Kingman was a slugger for the Mets, a power hitter. The kind of guy who could change a game with one swing. He wasn't perfect. He struck out a lot. His batting average wasn't great. He was all or nothing, home run or strikeout. But when he connected, the ball went a long way. Fans loved him for that. They loved the drama, the excitement, the possibility that every at-bat could be a moonshot. And just like Seaver, Kingman was fighting with the Mets front office over his contract. He wanted to be paid what he was worth. He wanted fair value for what he brought to the team. Management didn't want to pay him. They thought he was asking for too much. They thought he should just be grateful to play in New York. Sound familiar? It's the same story, the same conflict, the same power struggle. On the same night Seaver got traded, so did Kingman. Same exact night. June 15th, 1977, the Midnight Massacre. Seaver went to Cincinnati, Kingman went to San Diego. 2 stars gone in one night. Both dealt away like they were nothing. Like they were disposable. And that tells you everything you need to know. This wasn't about Seaver being difficult. This wasn't about him being hated by his teammates. This wasn't even personal. This was about management. Getting rid of anyone who stood up for themselves, anyone who challenged authority, anyone who dared to ask for what they deserved, anyone who refused to play the role of the grateful servant. Kingman's trade proves that Grant wasn't just targeting Seaver. He was purging the entire team of players who refused to bow down. He was sending a message to everyone: stay in line or get out. If you're enjoying this story and want to see more content about baseball's biggest controversies, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below. Tell me if you knew about the Midnight Massacre. Tell me if you've heard this story before, because a lot of people don't know the truth about what happened to Tom Seaver. They don't know how ugly it really was, and that needs to change. So if the legends didn't hate Seaver, who did? One man, M. Donald Grant. Grant was the chairman of the board for the New York Mets. He was a Wall Street guy, buttoned up, authoritarian, conservative, old school in every sense of the word. He wore expensive suits. He moved in elite circles. He belonged to country clubs. He ran the team like he ran his stock trades. Cold, calculated, everything by the numbers, everything about control. And he could not stand Tom Seaver. Why? Because Seaver was more famous than him. Seaver was beloved. Seaver was the face of the franchise. When people thought about the Mets, they thought about Seaver, not Grant, not the front office, not the owners. Seaver. Fans called him the franchise. That nickname drove Grant absolutely crazy. It ate at him. It consumed him. Because in Grant's mind, he was the franchise. He was the one making the decisions. He was the one in control. Not some pitcher, not some player who threw a ball for a living. One time, Grant pulled aside a sports writer named Jack Lang. Lang was a respected baseball journalist. He covered the Mets. He knew the team inside and out. Grant told him to stop calling Seaver the franchise. He didn't ask. He commanded. He said the real franchise was the owner, Mrs. Joan Payson, and himself. Not some player, not some employee. The franchise was management. The franchise was ownership. Seaver was just a worker, just a hired hand. He didn't deserve that title. He hadn't earned that respect. Think about that for a second. Think about how insecure you have to be to get angry about a nickname. To get angry that your best player is beloved by fans. Most executives would be thrilled. Most team leaders would celebrate having a star that popular. It's good for business. It's good for ticket sales. It's good for the brand. But Grant saw it as a threat, not to the team, to his own ego. He couldn't handle it. He couldn't stand that a player was bigger than him, that a player had more respect, more love, more power with the public than he did. But it went deeper than jealousy, much deeper. Grant hated what Seaver represented, and what Seaver represented was change, progress, a new way of thinking about the relationship between players and management. Seaver was smart, really smart. He went to the University of Southern California. He had a degree. He could articulate his thoughts. He spoke his mind to the press. He gave thoughtful interviews. He wasn't just a dumb jock who said whatever the team wanted him to say. He had opinions. He had ideas. He wasn't afraid to challenge authority. He wasn't afraid to ask questions. He wasn't afraid to push back when something didn't make sense. And worst of all, from Grant's perspective, Seaver was the Mets' union representative. Let that sink in. The union representative. Seaver wasn't just playing baseball. He was organizing. He was leading. He was fighting for the rights of all players, not just himself. He was part of a movement that threatened everything Grant believed in. Grant despised the players' union. He saw it as a threat to the natural order of baseball, an attack on the way things had always been. In Grant's world, owners were in charge. They made the rules. They set the salaries. They decided who played and who didn't. Players were employees, workers, servants even. Employees didn't get to negotiate. They didn't get to make demands. They certainly didn't get to organize and fight collectively for better conditions. That was radical. That was dangerous. That was wrong. In 1976, there was a lockout. The owners and the players were fighting over free agency. The owners wanted to maintain control. They wanted to keep salaries low. They wanted to prevent players from shopping their services to other teams. The players wanted freedom. They wanted the ability to negotiate. They wanted to be paid what they were worth. It was a war. And Seaver took a leadership role. He stood up for the players. He fought for their rights. He wasn't quiet. He wasn't passive. He was vocal. He was visible. He was a problem. Grant was furious. He was incensed. He saw Seaver as a traitor, a troublemaker, a communist even. Seaver later shared 2 quotes from Grant that perfectly captured the chairman's mindset. These quotes reveal everything you need to know about Grant's worldview, about his values, about why he hated Seaver so much. During the labor negotiations, Grant came up to Seaver in the clubhouse one day. He walked right up to him, got in his face, and he said, "What are you, some sort of communist?" That's how Grant saw collective bargaining, as communism, as socialism, as un-American. He wasn't interested in fairness. He wasn't interested in workers' rights. He was interested in control, in power. in maintaining the old order where owners ruled and players obeyed. The second quote came when Seaver bought a membership at a country club in Greenwich, Connecticut. Greenwich was an affluent town. Seaver was making good money. He had every right to join a nice club. He had earned it. He was one of the best pitchers in baseball. He was famous. He had money. Why shouldn't he enjoy the privileges that came with success? But to Grant, this was an outrage. Grant found out about the membership and confronted him. He looked Seaver in the eye and said, "Who do you think you are? Not congratulations. Not good for you. Not you've earned it. But who do you think you are?" As if Seaver had crossed some invisible line. As if he had stepped out of his lane. As if he had forgotten his place. Seaver was making good money. He had every legal and moral right to join that club. But to Grant, Seaver was crossing a line. A social line. A class line. He was trying to be Grant's equal. He was trying to enter Grant's world. The world of country clubs and stock portfolios and old money. And in Grant's mind, that was absolutely unacceptable. Players didn't belong in that world. They belonged on the field, in the clubhouse, in their place. A future commissioner of baseball, Bart Giamatti, later wrote about this. Giamatti was a scholar, an intellectual. He understood what was really happening. He said Grant believed in a strict social order, an old order, a hierarchy that couldn't be challenged. Players were hired hands. They were labor. They were workers. They weren't supposed to act like equals. They weren't supposed to act like golf partners. They weren't supposed to challenge the boss. They weren't supposed to join the same clubs, play on the same courses, move in the same circles. Grant couldn't understand why Seaver didn't know his place, why he didn't accept his station in life, why he thought he could be more than just a player. This wasn't just about baseball anymore. It was about class. It was about social order. It was about an old world fighting desperately to survive against a new world that was coming whether they liked it or not. Grant felt like Seaver was uppity. That word has a history. It's been used for generations to put people down, to remind them that they're not equal, that they're beneath someone else. Grant thought Seaver was too smart, too confident, too willing to fight back, too unwilling to accept his role as a servant. And Grant hated him for it. Grant felt personally insulted that Seaver dared to challenge him, dared to question him, dared to act like an equal instead of a subordinate. But Seaver wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting on two fronts. In 1976, Seaver signed a 3-year contract worth $675,000. At the time, it made him the highest-paid pitcher in baseball. But just a few months later, a new collective bargaining agreement changed everything. Salaries exploded. A dozen players signed deals worth over $1 million. Suddenly, Seaver's contract looked outdated. Seaver wanted to renegotiate. That was fair. The market had changed. He deserved to be paid what he was worth. But Grant refused. He saw it as greed. He saw it as betrayal. And Seaver wasn't just asking for more money for himself. He was also pushing the Mets to sign free agents. The team was struggling. They needed help. There were good players available. One of them was Gary Matthews, an outfielder who would have been a perfect fit. Seaver was disgusted that the Mets, a big market team that was still drawing big crowds, refused to spend money to win. Grant took this personally. In his mind, Seaver wasn't just asking for a raise, he was questioning Grant's authority. He was telling Grant how to run the team. And Grant couldn't tolerate that. So Grant had a problem. He hated Seaver. He wanted Seaver gone. But Seaver was the most popular player in New York. Trading him would cause a riot. Grant needed help. He needed someone to turn the fans against Seaver. He needed a hitman. And he found one in Dick Young. Dick Young was a columnist for the New York Daily News. He was powerful. He had a huge readership. And he was very conservative. As he got older, he became more and more reactionary. He hated the new era of free agency. He thought players were greedy. He thought they were spoiled. And he always took management's side. Young didn't just report the news. He attacked people. He was known for running vicious vendettas against players and other journalists. He used his column to smear people with lies and distortions. One writer called him a boorish thug with a column. Another said he wrote acerbic trash. Years later, Young would tell Mets fans to stand up and boo Dwight Gooden when he returned from drug rehab. That's the kind of guy he was. Cruel, mean-spirited, and perfectly willing to go after anyone if it served his agenda. Grant and Young were a perfect match. Young became a shill for the Mets organization. He attacked Seaver relentlessly in his columns. He called Seaver greedy. He said Seaver was jealous of other players. He painted Seaver as a spoiled diva who cared more about money than winning. Grant had hired him as the vice president of communications. That's a massive conflict of interest. Young wasn't an objective journalist. He was a father-in-law defending the organization that employed his family. Other journalists knew about this. They suspected Young was getting inside information from the Mets front office, information he used to attack Seaver. Young wasn't reporting the news. He was helping Grant wage war, and that war was about to reach its peak. By mid-June 1977, the situation was out of control. Seaver wanted out. The fans were confused, the media was split. But in a last-ditch effort, Seaver tried to make peace. He went over Grant's head. He contacted the team's owner, Lorinda de Roulet, directly. They talked. They negotiated. And it worked. They agreed to a 3-year extension. Trade talks were halted. Seaver was going to stay a Met for about 24 hours. The next day, Dick Young published a column. A despicable column. He didn't attack Seaver's pitching. He didn't attack his contract demands. He attacked Seaver's wife. Young wrote that Nolan Ryan was making more money than Seaver. And that bothered Tom because Nancy Seaver and Ruth Ryan were close friends. Young said Tom had always treated Nolan like a little brother, and now Nolan was making more money. It must have been humiliating, especially for Nancy. Then Young went further. He wrote, "It comes down to this. Tom Seaver is jealous. A man lives up to his contract. He was calling Seaver a liar, a cheat, a jealous, petty man whose wife was driving his decisions." Seaver went into a rage. The issue wasn't the money. It was that Young had dragged his wife into it. Nancy Seaver had done nothing wrong. She didn't deserve to be smeared in the newspaper. But Young didn't care. He was trying to provoke Seaver, and it worked. Seaver immediately called the Mets PR director. He said, "Get me out." He demanded a trade. The peace deal was dead. The relationship was over. And it was all because of Dick Young. Think about the timing. A peace deal had been reached the day before. Young's column came out the next morning. That's not a coincidence. Young knew about the deal. He almost certainly got the information from Grant or Geary, and he published the column specifically to sabotage it, to push Seaver past the point of no return. It worked perfectly. Grant got what he wanted. He could now trade Seaver and blame it on Seaver demanding out. Grant's official statement after the trade was a masterclass in spin. He said, "It is with sincere regret that we have met Tom Seaver's request and traded him to Cincinnati." He made it sound like he had no choice, like Seaver had forced his hand. But everyone knew the truth. Grant had engineered the whole thing. On June 15, 1977, the trade went through. Tom Seaver was sent to the Cincinnati Reds for 4 players: Pat Zachary, Doug Flynn, Dan Norman, Steve Henderson. One journalist had already called it a schoolboy drawing. It was a terrible return for one of the greatest pitchers in baseball. But Grant didn't care. He wanted Seaver gone, and he got his wish. To complete the purge, Dave Kingman was also traded that same night. 2 stars, gone. The front page of the New York Daily News screamed the headline, "Mets deal stars, Seaver to Reds, Kingman to SD." The event became known as the Midnight Massacre. And it was a black day in Mets history. The reaction from other journalists was swift and brutal. They knew what had happened, they knew who was to blame, and they weren't going to stay silent. Maury Allen was a sports writer for the New York Post. He was respected. He had been covering baseball for years. He knew the game, he knew the players, he knew the politics. And he knew what Dick Young had done. Allen broke the era's unwritten rule. He attacked another journalist by name. In that era, journalists didn't do that. They had an informal code. They didn't go after each other publicly. They kept their disputes private. But Allen felt this was too important. The stakes were too high. His story ran with a banner headline that would echo through baseball history. Dick Young ran Tom Seaver out of town. It was an open declaration of war. A direct accusation, a line in the sand. Allen wrote that he had never written about another newspaperman by name before. Never in his entire career, but he felt it was so important for fans to know the truth about Young's fight with Seaver. He felt people needed to understand what had really happened. This wasn't just baseball business. This wasn't just a trade. This was a character assassination that destroyed a franchise, and someone needed to say it out loud. Allen didn't just speculate. He didn't just give his opinion. He reported facts, hard facts. He wrote that Seaver himself had told him he was leaving because he couldn't play in a town where Dick Young was so powerful. Seaver had said this directly to Allen. It wasn't secondhand information. It wasn't a rumor. It was Seaver's own words. Young had made New York toxic for him, made it impossible to stay. The columnist had that much power, that much influence, and he used it to destroy someone's life. Allen also exposed the conflict of interest that everyone had been whispering about. He revealed that Young's son-in-law, Thornton Geary, worked for the Mets, that Grant had hired him, that Young was literally family with the Mets organization, that his objectivity was completely compromised. That's why Young was so sympathetic to Grant. That's why he always took management's side. That's why he attacked Seaver so viciously. He wasn't being a journalist. He was protecting his family's employer. He was doing favors for his relatives. It was corrupt. It was unethical. And Allen put it all out there for the world to see. Young lost his mind. He went on radio and TV to badmouth Allen in the Post. The feud wasn't just covered by the media, it was a war within the media. And it proved one thing. Everyone knew Young had sabotaged Seaver. Everyone knew Grant was behind it, and the truth was finally coming out. But the media war was nothing compared to what the fans did, because the fans delivered the most devastating verdict. The Midnight Massacre is still remembered as the Mets' most unforgivable sin in history. Even decades later, even after championships and Hall of Famers and great moments, this trade stands out. It's the worst thing the Mets ever did to their fans. The ultimate betrayal. Fans didn't just get angry, they didn't just complain on sports radio, they felt betrayed. Deeply, personally betrayed. Like someone had stabbed them in the back, like their trust had been violated. One fan later shared a memory of his father that captures the feeling perfectly. He said it was the only time in his entire life his dad had cursed the team. His father, who had been a loyal Mets fan through all the losing seasons, through all the disappointments, said something he never said about anything. He said, "They can go to hell, I'm done." He felt so betrayed that he cursed Monsieur Donald Grant. And he kept cursing him. He never let it go. He cursed Grant until the day he died. That's how deep the wound went. That's how much it hurt. Nancy Seaver summed it up perfectly. She understood what her husband had lost, what had been taken from him. She said Tom wanted to live and die a Met. That was his dream. To spend his entire career in New York. To retire with the team he helped turn into champions. His loyalty was absolute. He gave everything to that organization, and his loyalty was thrown in his face. Spat on, destroyed. Tom was hurt badly. Nancy said she didn't think he'd ever admit how much. Men like Tom don't show that kind of pain. But it was there. He wanted to live and die a Met, and they jilted him. They betrayed him. They threw him away like he was nothing. The fans responded the only way they could. They stayed away. Attendance plummeted. Shea Stadium became a dreary, empty tomb. And that's what fans called it. Grant's Tomb. It was the perfect, bitter pun. Grant's Tomb is a famous monument in Manhattan, the burial place of President Ulysses S. Grant. But now, Shea Stadium was also Grant's tomb, a dead stadium, killed by M. Donald Grant. And the numbers back it up. In 1976, before the trade, the Mets drew over 1,468,000 fans to Shea Stadium. In 1977, the year of the trade, attendance dropped to 1,066,000. That's a 27% drop. By 1978, it was down to 1,007,000. By 1979, it collapsed to 788,000, a 46% drop from 1976. Nearly half the fans were gone. They voted with their wallets and their feet. Their message was clear. They didn't hate Tom Seaver. They hated M. Donald Grant. Grant was finally forced out in 1978. But the damage was done. The Mets entered their darkest era. They became a laughingstock, a symbol of futility and mismanagement. All because one man couldn't stand that a player was beloved. So let's go back to the beginning. Did Tom Seaver deserve to be hated? Absolutely, but not by the legends. Not by his peers, not by the fans. He deserved to be hated by a Wall Street executive who saw baseball players as property. He deserved to be hated by a corrupt journalist who used his column to wage personal vendettas. He deserved to be hated by a system that couldn't accept smart, independent athletes who demanded respect. Grant and Young hated Seaver because he represented the future. A future where players had power, where they could negotiate, where they could speak their minds, where they didn't have to bow down to owners and executives. Seaver was everything the old guard feared, and they destroyed him for it. But they didn't just destroy Seaver. They destroyed the Mets. They destroyed a championship team. They turned a packed stadium into a graveyard. And they earned a legacy that will never be forgotten. Grant's Tomb, a fitting monument to hate, ego, and the death of a dynasty. Before we wrap up, I want to hear from you. What part of the Tom Seaver story shocked you the most? Was it Grant's jealousy, Dick Young's betrayal, the fact that Nancy Seaver was dragged into it? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button now. Because there are a lot more stories like this one. Stories about the legends who changed the game, and the people who tried to stop them. The hate for Tom Seaver was real, but it came from the wrong people. It came from men who couldn't stand change. Men who saw athletes as servants, not partners. Men who believed money and power gave them the right to crush anyone who stood up to them. And in the end, they lost. Seaver went to Cincinnati. He kept winning. He made the Hall of Fame. His legacy is secure. Grant and Young, they're remembered as villains, as symbols of everything that was wrong with baseball. as the men who killed the Mets and built their own tomb in the process.
Why did MLB hate Rickey Henderson so much? Here was a player with absolutely incredible talent, holding records that may never be broken. But you can't ignore the fact that he was one of the most controversial and widely disliked players in baseball history. So what made a player this good so hated by fans and opponents alike? What was it about Rickey Henderson that rubbed everyone the wrong way? Let's be clear about one thing first. Rickey Henderson was undeniably one of the greatest players to ever step on a baseball field. His numbers were absolutely insane. He holds the all-time record for stolen bases with 1,046 steals. That's not just beating the previous record, that's completely destroying it. Lou Brock held the old record with 938 steals, and Henderson beat him by 468 bases. That's more than a 50% increase over the guy who came before him. Henderson also scored more runs than any player in baseball history with 2,195 runs. He even beat the legendary Ty Cobb. He hit 81 leadoff home runs, which is still a record today, and he walked more than anyone except Barry Bonds with 2,129 unintentional walks. These stats show that Henderson was absolutely dominant on the field. But here's where things get weird. Despite all that talent, Henderson developed a reputation as one of the most arrogant and self-absorbed players in the game. And it all started with the way he talked about himself. Henderson had this bizarre habit of referring to himself in the third person. Instead of saying, "I want to play baseball," he would say, "Rickey wants to play baseball." This wasn't just occasionally. He did this all the time, and it drove people absolutely crazy. The most famous example happened when he was trying to get signed by the San Diego Padres. Henderson allegedly left a voicemail for general manager Kevin Towers that said, "Kevin, this is Rickey, calling on behalf of Rickey. Rickey wants to play baseball." Can you imagine getting a message like that? It sounds like he's talking about himself as if he's some kind of celebrity who needs an agent. But it gets worse. Teammates reported that Henderson would stand in front of mirrors before games, pumping himself up by chanting, "Rickey's the best," over and over again. After striking out, he would comfort himself by muttering things like, "Don't worry, Rickey, you're still the best." This is the kind of behavior you'd expect from a cartoon character, not a professional athlete. When Henderson was traded to the New York Yankees, a reporter asked him about playing on the same field as legends like Joe DiMaggio and Mickey Mantle. His response? "I don't care about them. It's Rickey time." The complete lack of respect for baseball history was shocking to fans and the media. Henderson tried to defend this weird speech pattern by claiming it was blown out of proportion. He said he used it to motivate himself and that he would scold himself by saying things like, "Rickey, what the heck are you doing?" But come on. Nobody believed that excuse. When you're constantly referring to yourself in the third person, especially in professional settings, it just screams massive ego problem. The whole thing reached its peak on May 1st, 1991, when Henderson stole his 939th base and broke Lou Brock's all-time record. This should have been a moment of pure celebration and respect for baseball history. Instead, it became one of the most controversial moments in sports. The game was stopped to honor Henderson's achievement. Lou Brock himself came out to congratulate him. Henderson was given a microphone to address the crowd. He started off fine, thanking God, his family, and the fans. But then he ended his speech with the most arrogant line in baseball history. "Today, I'm the greatest of all time." Think about how disrespectful that was. Here's Lou Brock, the previous record holder, standing right there on the field. This man had held the stolen base record for years and was gracious enough to come celebrate Henderson's achievement. And Henderson's response was to basically tell everyone that he was better than Brock and every other player who had ever lived. The timing made it even worse. That same night, Nolan Ryan threw his 7th no-hitter. Here you had Ryan, a humble veteran who let his performance speak for itself, compared to Henderson making outrageous claims about being the greatest ever. The contrast couldn't have been more obvious. One player showed class and humility, while the other showed nothing but arrogance. The media and fans were outraged by Henderson's declaration. It was seen as the ultimate example of his out-of-control ego. This wasn't confidence. This was pure narcissism on display for the whole world to see. But Henderson's arrogance wasn't just limited to what he said. His entire style of play was designed to show off and irritate opponents. Everything he did on the field seemed calculated to draw attention to himself. At the plate, Henderson used this ridiculously exaggerated crouch that made him look shorter than he actually was. Sure, it might have made his strike zone smaller, but it also looked completely bizarre. Pitcher Tom Candiotti described Henderson's strike zone as being the size of a coffee can. Henderson claimed this stance helped him see the ball better, but it really just looked like another way to be different and get attention. On the base pass, Henderson made the head-first slide his signature move. While other players used this technique occasionally, Henderson turned it into a show. He would dive headfirst into bases with dramatic flair, getting his uniform dirty on purpose. He even bragged about it, saying, "If my uniform doesn't get dirty, I haven't done anything in the baseball game." Henderson's showboating reached ridiculous levels in the outfield too. He invented something called the snatch catch, where he would catch fly balls one-handed below his waist instead of using both hands like a normal player. He debuted this move during a no-hitter, making what should have been a routine catch into a circus act. After big hits, Henderson would pop his collar and take these wide, looping turns around the bases on home runs. When he was leading off a base, he would wiggle his fingers at the pitcher as if he was taunting them. Every single thing he did was designed to be as flashy and attention-grabbing as possible. Henderson defended his style by saying he wanted to beat opponents in the worst way, and that if that made him cocky, so be it. But this wasn't just competitive fire. This was deliberate disrespect toward the game and his opponents. Opposing players absolutely hated Henderson's antics. Tom Candiotti admitted, "I hated Ricky. Really, I couldn't stand him." This hatred came from the constant frustration of dealing with Henderson's showboating and mind games. Henderson would call other players to mess with their heads. When Harold Reynolds led the league in stolen bases during Henderson's injury year in 1987, Henderson called him up and said, "60 bases? Man, Ricky got 60 by the All-Star break," then hung up. This kind of psychological warfare went way beyond normal competition. On the base pass, Henderson would chat with first baseman and sometimes even announce his intention to steal before doing it. He turned baseball into his personal entertainment show, with himself as the star attraction. What made Henderson so infuriating was that he combined incredible talent with an absolutely toxic personality. He had the skills to back up his attitude, which somehow made it even worse. Players and fans could hate his arrogance, but they couldn't deny his ability. Henderson lived in his own world where he was the center of everything. His constant self-promotion and attention-seeking behavior overshadowed his teammates and made every game about him. Even when he was supposed to be celebrating team achievements, Henderson found ways to make it about Ricky. The media grew tired of his act too. Henderson's quotes became so predictably self-centered that reporters knew exactly what kind of responses they would get. He turned interviews into opportunities for self-worship rather than discussing the team or the game. Henderson's selfish attitude extended to how he interacted with the baseball community. While other great players showed respect for the history of the game and the players who came before them, Henderson seemed to believe that baseball history started with him. But here's the thing about Ricky Henderson that you can't ignore. Despite all his infuriating personality traits and controversial behavior, the man could absolutely play baseball. His statistical dominance wasn't an accident. That supreme confidence, even if it came across as pure arrogance, was actually the fuel that powered his record-breaking career. Henderson's belief in himself was so complete that it allowed him to take risks other players wouldn't dare attempt. He tried to steal 1,741 bases over his career and succeeded 80.8% of the time. That kind of success rate requires not just physical ability, but mental toughness and unshakable self-belief. His longevity was incredible too. Henderson led the American League in stolen bases for almost the entire decade of the 1980s. At age 39, he still led the league with 66 steals. He stole over 100 bases after turning 40, which are both records for players his age. Henderson was elected to the Hall of Fame in his first year of eligibility with nearly 95% of the vote. That kind of overwhelming support from baseball writers shows that, despite all the controversy, his talent was undeniable. Ricky Henderson will forever be remembered as one of baseball's most polarizing figures. He was a player you either loved or, more likely, loved to hate. His arrogance and showboating made him one of the most disliked players of his era, but his incredible statistics prove that sometimes the most annoying players are also the most effective ones. If you enjoyed learning about baseball's most controversial superstar, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the players who changed the game. What do you think about Ricky Henderson? Was he just confident, or was he truly one of the most arrogant players ever? Let me know in the comments below.